Okay, well, good evening, everybody. It's time for another episode of My Shot, and as I promised last week, this evening we'll be concentrating on warfare in countries, countries between countries, nations between nations, and what should the Christian response be? A lot of times Christians will once again try to bow out and they'll plead conscientious objector when in fact if their own family's lives were at risk they cannot. As far as with a volunteer army, I've never been in favor of war myself, and as far as having a volunteer army, if a person wants to volunteer to go into the armed forces, that's all well and good, but if you are drafted by your nation you really have no choice, because you must follow the will of the government that you are involved in. That we covered last week in Romans chapter 14, where the magistrate bears not the sword in vain, but rather is a vessel of God to those that doeth evil. So the problem lies in just war in general. And with the Bible, the biggest problem is Jesus doesn't mention it at all. He says to his disciples that in the coming days there will be wars and rumors of wars. Nations will rise up against nations, and there will be famines and earthquakes in many diverse places. And we are not to be alarmed, for this is just the beginning of woes. And that seems to me to have been the history of mankind from the beginning. As far as what the Bible does say about warfare, we have a small amount of writing in the letter to Paul's letter to the Roman church in Romans chapter 12 verse 18. He says, "If it be possible, as much as lieth within you, live peaceably with all men." Now anytime you have a conditional clause with the word if it be possible, as much as lieth within you, live peaceably with all men, you can draw the conclusion that it won't always be possible for this to happen. James also makes another remark in his writings, and that's James, the brother of Jesus. In chapter 4, verse 1, he says, "From whence do wars come, and whence are fightings among you? Come they not hence even from your own lusts that war in your body?" And that is not always true. We know that. We know that sometimes war is in defense, and quite frequently the United States has fought in defense, either in defense of principles on its own soil or in defense of itself. The American Civil War, for example, we did not fire the first shot. The first shot was fired by Citadel students when Fort Sumter was being refortified after the Confederacy had already seceded from the Union. Some wars are not as clear-cut as that. The Spanish-American War, the Spanish unfortunately had already agreed to the cessation of warfare. They had already surrendered, if you like, before we landed on Cuban soil. That could have been a problem with communications. We just couldn't get the communications well enough. World War I, on the other hand, was just a family squabble, and Woodrow Wilson, family squabble in Europe, by the way, and Woodrow Wilson tried to keep us out of it as long as possible. But when the Zimmerman letter came through indicating that the Germans were petitioning the Mexicans to invade Texas from the south, the country didn't take it very lightly, and they decided to enter into war against Germany. There is no question that we were in defense of ourselves during World War II, fighting both Japan and Germany, with Japan having struck the first blow at Pearl Harbor, and in the war in Korea. There's no question that we were properly defending our position in South Korea when the Soviets placed 100,000 tanks at the border of North and South Korea. Things haven't gone so well always since then. I think we have some wars that we need not have fought. Vietnam was one of them. And perhaps Iraq would have been the next. Afghanistan, we had no choice. Afghanistan, the leader of Al-Qaeda, who was at the time Osama bin Laden, declared responsibility for the strike, said he was hiding out in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan agreed, and then wouldn't give him up. And that's kind of like Al Capone being in the hotel, and you tell the hotel manager to send him out, and the hotel manager says, no, we won't. So the police go in, and they get Al Capone. And so Afghanistan had very, very good roots, as did Desert Storm, the initial assault on Iraq from Kuwait, when Iraq had violated the sovereignty of Kuwait, and the King of Kuwait petitioned America to help free them from their adversaries. But as to war itself, can an American Christian participate in war? The answer is undoubtedly yes, but it's undoubtedly private. I would never volunteer for war myself, or volunteer for the army, because you're going to find that you may be put in the position to kill. I'm always stunned by the young man during the Desert Storm who walked all the way to the plane and then sat down on the steps of the plane and refused to go. He was a member of the National Guard. He was called up into service. He knew what his service might someday be, and to refuse to go at that point was once again breaking the law. So you have to know what you're getting yourself into. But let's turn back also to just one more passage that we have, and that's a passage from Luke's Gospel, and it's in relationship to John the Baptist, as he speaks to the people who have come to him for baptism, come to him to be cleansed of their sins. And it says, then also the tax collectors came that had been baptized, said unto him, Master, what shall we do? And he said unto them, exact more than which is appointed unto you. And the soldiers, and these would be Roman soldiers. Remember, Judea was occupied by Rome from 68 BC on. They did not have their own standing army, so there were no Judean soldiers or Israeli soldiers. And the soldiers likewise demanded of John, saying, and what shall we do? And John answered them and said, do violence to no man, neither accuse any falsely. Now, a lot of people have misinterpreted that, do violence to no man. You have to remember this was an occupying army and had been occupying for close to 90 years now. And to do violence to men would be to take advantage of them. Quite similarly to what we ran into with the American Revolution, where it was lawful for the British soldiers to arbitrarily be billeted or housed in your house without your permission, to be fed from your food that you had to pay for, and they stayed there. And this was the way that King George III kept his expenses down after having fought the French and Indian War, and after having fought the Scots about 10 years prior to the French and Indian War, to the 7-Year War as it was known in Europe. And it would be the same thing. There would be abusing people or making violence against them. You can't ask a Roman soldier not to follow orders or he will be killed. So to enact no violence against men means that while you're here in this sedentary position just guarding these towns, don't take advantage of your position, but be content with your wages and just go about your business. The war itself was broken down initially by Augustine as what could be considered a just war. First of all, there must be an aggressor and there must be a passive nation. Someone must be invaded, then you have the right to defend yourself. It must be as brief a war as is humanly possible. It must have an ending which is foreseeable. And it must take out as few civilian lives or collateral damage as is humanly possible. And of course, in today's generation, that has become less and less able to articulate. Even during World War II, when we were fighting the Germans, because the Germans put their factories inside the many buildings in Copenhagen and Rotterdam, we had to level those cities, and at the same time we had to kill numerous civilians living in those cities. So the call is up to you. The call is certainly up to each and every Christian to figure out whether they are going to be the ones to take arms for their nation against an aggressor. If someone comes onto our land from a foreign soil, I would hope that we would all take arms to defend ourselves. Thank you.